Today we're checking out Avatar: Fire and Ash on 4K and 3D Blu-ray. This movie was shot in 4K 3D. It's got a 4K DI. It's rated PG-13. Runtime is 195 minutes. Aspect ratio is 185:1, and the audio is in Dolby Atmos and DTS HD 7.1 for the 3D version. Now, I'm not going to be reviewing the movie itself. I'm just going to share some thoughts on the video and audio quality. Now, before we get into the audio, as reference, I've got an 18-channel Krix home theater setup with 8 RBH subwoofers for a 12.8.6 layout. We're going to take a look at the Dolby Atmos Object Viewer, which is going to show you what speakers in my system is making sound or is not making sound. You can also find a list of all the equipment that I use for these reviews down in the video's description. All right, so here we are at the Dolby Atmos Object Viewer, and everything that I said about the 4K iTunes digital streaming version stands pretty much the same as it is for the 4K Blu-ray version. The main difference is we do have some higher resolution audio with this lossless Dolby Atmos mix, so spatial cues are a bit easier to discern coming from the surround channels. So sound panning and different little tiny surround effects are a little bit easier to locate. Also, the front stage does sound a little bit more spacious as well. And just like the 4K iTunes version, most of this does remain in a 7.1.2 configuration for most of the runtime. However, we do have some scenes such as this one with Kiri going to see Awa, where we do have a lot of dynamic objects that do utilize all 18 of my channels. So it's mostly just a bunch of surround effects that are swirling throughout the soundstage, which will give you a full-on immersive feel. Some of these aerial battles will hear missiles flying by through the top channels as they go from the front stage to the backstage. We have the flying birds or flying dragons flying through the sky from overhead down to the bed layer. So for these really big action scenes, we do have some dynamic objects that will use more than 7.1.2 channels. And as far as bass response, it is a slight upgrade over the 4K digital stream with a little bit more heft down low. However, I would rate this bass response in this movie to be kind of mid-level. Although the scenes that take place with the whales, when they are talking to the Avatar or they're talking to the Na'vi, those scenes have a ton of bass and will for sure rumble your house and maybe even your neighbor's house as well. I would say that the bass response is kind of mediocre at best. And the dialogue was always easy to hear throughout. Video quality wise, this is just as good as Avatar Part 2. Now, I'm sure there are some textures and other effects that might be a little bit better, but I wasn't going to go frame by frame to make the comparisons. Also, keep in mind that this movie is all CG and not AI generated. I know some of the younger people out there were thinking that this is just all AI, but that's not the case. Maybe 4 and 5 will be AI generated to save some money on production, so we'll have to wait and see. Anyways, this looks just as close to real life as you can get, right down to wrinkles and those little tiny fibers in clothing. It doesn't matter if it's a close-up or wide shot, this movie is not lacking for any high-resolution detail. The HDR is bright and colorful, with primaries that are richly saturated and will look fantastic on any HDR-capable display. The highlights could sometimes look overblown, which is a bit more noticeable on the second Avatar, and it still does look a little bit hot here too. This might be a specific look that they were going for, but highlight detail can be lacking in some of these brighter daytime scenes. Other than that, this is a bright movie all the way through and never looked dim unless it was a nighttime scene, which had great shadow detail without anything being crushed. I also found that the 3D version, while it wasn't as bright as the 4K version, obviously, since you do have to wear those 3D glasses, still looked amazing color-wise on the XGIMI Titan Noir. And no, this isn't a sponsored video or a sponsored ad for the Titan. So the brighter your projector or TV, if you still have a 3D TV, the better the 3D is going to work its immersive magic. I didn't notice any crosstalk or issues with the 3D transfer. Highlights look just as overly hot in the same parts as the 4K version, and even shadow detail and black levels look just as good as well. Positive thing about the 3D glasses is that it will enhance your blacks, since 3D glasses are essentially like sunglasses. Details are going to be a step behind the 4K version, but since this was shot and rendered in 3D natively, this really is the only true way to experience this movie the way Cameron wanted you to see it. The aerial battles on a big enough screen can give you a sense of lightheadedness with the amount of depth that reaches really far into the screen, which the 2D flat version will give you none of. Layer separation looked perfect without any weird 3D conversion artifacts that non-native 3D movies can sometimes have. And there are several shots of arrows and guns pointing straight at the screen to give you that in-your-face effect. I do really like those tiny small particles that were floating around the characters, which seems trivial, but it's those tiny little details that make the 3D version feel like a true three-dimensional lived-in space. Scale is also way more elevated in 3D, making the whales look ginormous, and the open spaces just seem to go on forever. Both the 4K and 3D versions do have a light layer of film emulation to give this a more film-like non-digital look, but still, both versions have extremely sharp, crisp details. They are also both 24 frames per second like parts 1 and part 2, and do not support the higher frame rate that was shown at certain theaters. So video quality wise, this is the pinnacle for CG. It's got tons of detail, great HDR, and looks as good, if not better, than the previous two movies. I'm gonna go with a 9.9 for 4K video. The 3D version is my preferred way to watch these movies. Unfortunately, it is on 2 discs, so you are gonna have to get up and swap them in and out. But at least you do have a little bit of an intermission. I'm gonna go with a 10 for 3D video. Audio-wise on the 4K Blu-ray, it is a little more detailed up top, coming from the digital stream, but it is still mostly in a 7.1.2 layout, but does come to life on some of the bigger action scenes. And the bass was just alright except for the space whale scenes, which will have your house shaking. I'm gonna go with an 8.2 for the 4K Atmos audio. The 3D version does lack the overhead immersion, but I did feel that the bass was a little bit deeper than the Atmos version. So I'm gonna go with an 8 for audio on the 3D disc. So which version do you prefer? 4K or 3D? Leave me a comment down below and let me know. Now, if you do want to grab this movie, I will leave some links for it down below in this video's description. And thanks for watching.